Hello, Coach Holmes here, and today we're going to talk about proving parallel lines through a transverse, through a transversal. Okay? So basically, what we actually have here, instead of the actual corresponding angles statements, we actually have the converse of it. So if you remember, the converse of it is taking the hypothesis and the conclusion and switching them together. Okay? And just switching them. So if I have the hypothesis and the conclusion, I switch them, so the conclusion becomes my new hypothesis, and the conclusion becomes my new hypothesis. My hypothesis becomes my new conclusion. Okay? So, for example, the converse of corresponding angles states if the pair of corresponding angles are congruent, then the lines are parallel. Okay? So the original hypothesis was the lines are parallel, and the conclusion was if the pair of corresponding angles are congruent. But this time I switched them because that's what a converse is. Okay? I switched them. Now I can do the same thing with the converse of alternate interior angles, and it still works out the same way. But the only difference is that now the pair of alternate interior angles are congruent, then the lines are parallel. So just to write it down, if the pair of alternate interior angles are congruent, then the lines are parallel. Okay? So the converse does work for the same way for alternate interior angles. Now, another converse that we're looking at is alternate exterior angles. If the pair of alternate exterior angles are congruent, then the lines are parallel. Now, if we recall, consecutive interior angles doesn't mean that both angles are congruent. It's just that both angles add up to 180. So this is the only pair of angles where the angles are not congruent. They only add up to 180. So if the pair of consecutive interior angles adds to 180 degrees, then the lines are parallel. Okay? So as long as we have consecutive interior angles that add up to 180, the lines are still going to be parallel to each other. Now, transitive property of parallel lines is simply saying that if we have three different pairs of lines, if they're parallel, if the pairs are parallel to each other, then they're all going to be parallel to each other. So let me simply write it out. If line A is parallel to line B, and line B is parallel to C, then line A is parallel to line C. Okay? So if the first line is parallel to the second line parallel to the third line, then both the first and third pair of lines are going to be parallel. So they're going to be parallel to each other is initially what we're talking about. All three of those lines are going to be parallel to each other. Now, so let's look at this. So let's say we need to solve for x in order to determine that the angles are congruent to each other and that the lines are parallel. Or at least basically we're trying to prove for x where the lines are parallel to each other. Well, remember, I got a pair of alternate exterior angles. Now, if you recall, alternate exterior angles are congruent to each other. So in order to solve for x, I got to set it up as 112 equals 4x. Okay? So now, in order to solve for this, I got to divide 4 to both sides. So I get x equals 4 divided by 12 is simply 28. Okay? So because they're alternate exterior angles, I got to set them equal to each other. Now, we do the same thing for this problem, but first I got to figure out what type of pair of angles that I have. Well, I know both of these angles are inside and they're back to back to each other. So I got consecutive interior angles. So what does that mean? Well, both of these adds up to 180. Okay? So I just simply add it up, set it equal to 180. 4x plus 2x, that's simply 6x equals 180. And then I got to divide by 6 on my coefficient. X cancels out, the 6 cancels out, and I get 30. So my value for x in this problem is going to be 30. Now these last two, I want to determine what two lines are going to be parallel to each other. Okay? So I got the option of either A is parallel to B or C is parallel to D. Now, I can't say that C is parallel to A because if you look, this is where they intersect, right? So that won't work. So really, I only have two possible pairs of parallel lines. But I just got to identify pairs, either alternate exterior angles, alternate interior angles, corresponding angles, or consecutive interior angles. So if I look right here, I have two pair of angles that are congruent to each other. And they are alternate interior angles, okay? So my transversal here is B. Now, transversal does not mean that the lines are parallel. Well, let me rephrase that. This transversal is going to intersect both D and C. So that means this transversal is going through parallel lines of C and D. So line C is parallel to line D. That's how I will know, because I identified B as my transversal, and of course the transversal is not the parallel lines because it's crossing through multiple lines. So the two is crossing is C and D, which means C and D are my parallel lines. Now I go to my next problem here. Again, I want to be able to identify which pair of lines are parallel to each other. So I got A possibly parallel to B, or C possibly parallel to D. And that's what these little lines are. That just tell you that A is parallel to B and line C is parallel to D. That's what these lines tell you. Parallel to. Okay? Now, if you look, I got two congruent angles. Now, they're not alternate to each other, but they're kind of in a general area for each one. So these are corresponding angles. Now, my transversal here is D, so that means my two lines that's crossing is A and B. So A and B are my parallel lines, okay? So the one thing we actually learned about today is the fact that when we have a pair of consecutive interior angles, alternate exterior angles, alternate interior angles, and corresponding angles, if we have a pair of those where consecutive interior angles add up to 180, and the other three are congruent, or possibly the other three are congruent, then the two lines are parallel to each other, okay? So instead of being given the fact that the lines are parallel, we're given the fact that consecutive interior angles adds up to 180, or alternate interior angles or alternate exterior angles or corresponding angles are congruent to each other. That's what we've been given, and we end up proving that the lines are parallel. Thank you, and have a good day.